Greetings and welcome into the Hoosier Podcast presented by TheHoosier.com and powered by the Rivals Network. My name is Zach Browning, and we're back for another week of discussing the latest on Indiana athletics. Colin McMahon joins me on this fine afternoon. Colin, how's the week before finals week, dead week as we call it here, treating you?
Been just fine. I mean, a little busy with everything going on in Indiana athletics, but no complaints.
Well, let's go ahead and jump right into things this afternoon. Indiana football, college football playoff bound. They have a matchup set, the number 10 seed Indiana Hoosiers against the number 7 seed Notre Dame Fighting Irish. December 20th, a standalone game, 8 p.m. Eastern Time in prime time in South Bend at Notre Dame Stadium. The winner, of course, would go on to play number 2 Georgia in the Sugar Bowl. And that's a Georgia team that would be without Carson Beck in that game. But Colin, since we haven't had a Hoosier podcast episode since the reveal of the 12-team college football playoff bracket, what are your initial thoughts on the 12 teams that got in and how they were seeded and how they were ranked?
I thought the committee got it right. There was a lot of backlash based on, the seeding process itself because of the, top four conference champions getting those top four bids. And that's a separate discussion, but based on the rules and regulations for the committee, I think they got it right. I think that SMU over Alabama was the correct choice. Honestly, were either of those teams playoff worthy? I'm not sure, but you do have to have 12 teams in there, and I think SMU was more worthy than Alabama. And obviously, Indiana slots in at the number 10 seed, which Kurt Signetti thinks is a little low. He thinks that the Hoosiers should have hosted a game, but they'll travel to South Bend instead. And I think that's a good matchup, for the state of Indiana. It's really exciting. It's what I wanted as someone who would have traveled to wherever Indiana was playing to cover the game. I think covering a game in South Bend is going to be really enjoyable, and it should be a really good matchup between two really good teams as well.
I'd agree with you, Colin. SMU over Alabama, probably the right choice in my eyes as well for the committee. And I guess we'll thank Georgia for beating Texas in the SEC championship game. That's really why Indiana gets the trip to South Bend, the in-state rivalry, rather than going to a place like Athens or like Columbus. Indiana gets to stay in-state. It's just about a 3.5 hour drive up north from Bloomington to South Bend for Indiana to take on Notre Dame. Colin, you kind of touched on a little bit. You think it'll be a good matchup. I think so as well. It'll be a decent matchup as far as just the strengths are concerned. Indiana's rushing defense, the number one rushing defense in the country. Notre Dame has one of the top five-ish ranked rushing attacks in the country as well. We'll see if Indiana can sort of overcome and exercise those demons playing in a large, loud, and road hostile environment. Of course, Indiana struggled with the noise at the shoe against Ohio State. We'll see if Indiana can kind of overcome those challenges that they saw at the shoe in South Bend against Notre Dame. Also, some football news this week. The transfer portal opened on Monday, the really busiest part of the season for coaches around the country because coaches that are still preparing for a bowl game, you've got that, but you've also got to get some kids scheduled for visits and hit the transfer portal hard, especially if you're a team like Indiana, which is expected to lose a lot of guys and a handful of starters due to lack of eligibility remaining. So Indiana's going to have to hit the transfer portal as well. There's a couple of visits that are scheduled and have been reported for Indiana. There's a couple of guys that have reportedly entered the portal that were Hoosiers this past season as well. We'll just direct everyone over to our transfer portal tracker on thehoosier.com. You can just go to thehoosier.com. It'll be one of those featured stories on the front page. Indiana football's 2024 transfer portal tracker. You can check out and stay up to date on all of the latest Indiana football transfer portal news right there. Also, we'll get ahead and move on to basketball. Now, not much Indiana football discussion this week because we're going to have a full Indiana football dedicated episode of the Hoosier Podcast next week, going in detail and detailing and previewing the matchup of Indiana versus Notre Dame in South Bend. So this is going to be a more basketball heavy podcast. So with that, Colin, we're going to jump into the Hoosiers on the hardwood. 2-0 this past week, 2-0 since last time we recorded a podcast with wins over Miami of Ohio on Friday and Minnesota on Monday. We'll start with the Miami of Ohio win. It was a good win, a 19-point win for Indiana, 76-57, the final score. And right away, what jumps off the page to me, Colin, is 57 points allowed against the Miami of Ohio team, where they had one player score 42 the game before they visited Indiana in Bloomington. The Red Hawks went 7 for 16 from three in the first half, were hot to start the game. But then Indiana's defense locked down in the second half, allowing just 21 second half points. There was a great defensive performance, I guess, overall, just because of the 57 points allowed, Colin. But those 21 points allowed in the second half, it was a great showing in those final 20 minutes for Indiana defensively.
Yeah, that second half was really telling of, how the trajectory of the season might go, just because Miami of Ohio was the last non-conference game before we get the Big Ten play appetizer with Minnesota, where we'll get into that later. But it was a close game against the Red Hawks early on. It was back and forth. Indiana kind of, got the first blow in the first half, but Miami kept fighting back and fighting back. I think they had like three separate runs in that second half where, they would just make two threes back to back and they would, claw back. And I think it was only a 3-point lead at halftime, if I'm remembering correctly. And so you take a 3-point lead and then make that a 19-point win. That's pretty impressive for the second half. And I talked to Travis Steele, the Miami, Ohio head coach after the game, and he said that, Indiana's offense was just incredible in that second half. He mentions the big guys, Ballo, Renew, were just, too much for his team, and you saw it out there on the court and, you know, led to the big Hoosier win on Friday.
You bring up Ballo and Renew. They were probably the two keys. Not only defensively, Ballo was great on the defensive side of things, especially in that second half as well, protecting the rim. But offensively, it was really a culmination of what Indiana fans have been looking for really to begin this season. There's been a lot that has been made of Indiana's lineup struggles, whether it's one big or two big lineup that works the best for this Indiana team this year with Ballo and Renew. Against Miami of Ohio last Friday, it was the two big lineup that worked best for Indiana. Ballo had 14 points, 18 rebounds, and 6 assists. Malik Renew had a game high 19 points and 7 rebounds as well. But to me, Colin, the biggest turning point in this game and really the biggest symbol of what Indiana's two big lineup can be came in the second half with just over 9 minutes to play. Malik Renew came off the bench. Umar Ballo was already in the game. Renew joined Ballo in that lineup on the floor. It was a two big lineup for Indiana. And the Hoosiers immediately, as soon as Renew checked into the game and Indiana went with that two big lineup, the Hoosiers went on an 11-0 run to give IU's a 17-point lead. It went from a 6-point lead to a 17-point lead for the Hoosiers in a matter of minutes. And I think post-game was really telling. Umar Ballo said, quote, "I feel we have a really good flow together," when talking about Malik Renew. And we really kind of saw the connection between Ballo and Renew. Of course, 6 assists for Umar Ballo was impressive, Colin, but we really kind of saw the connection between Indiana's two bigs and what that two big lineup can potentially be.
For sure. And, there's been a lot of debate whether it should be a two big lineup, whether it should be a one big lineup, and why not both? Why don't you, mix and match? At times the two big lineup is better, and at times the one big lineup is better. And it's a matter of scouting the opponent, seeing what you're seeing on the floor, and then making that assessment of, okay, we need to take Ballo on the floor. He's getting a little tired on defense, or, we have a real size advantage if we have both of them in, have both of them in. Or if, Renew needs a breather, you take him out and go small, and then you throw Luke Goody in there who can make threes. And, there's a lot of possibilities. And when we were doing our IU basketball preview episode, we all talked about how this is a well-rounded team that you can have several different lineups and you have a lot of options. And I think that's going to be seen with this two big versus one big lineup. And the debate on Twitter or wherever else is you know, kind of disappointing because why not you just throw out both of them in different parts of the game and see what works?
You're exactly right. I think it's just a matter of what works that night. And this season is a little bit like a chameleon team to me in that sense, where they can beat you in a handful of different ways, not just a handful of different players, but a handful of different styles, whether it's Malik Renew and Umar Ballo scoring a combined 40 plus points in the paint. They can do that. Indiana can beat you that way. They can also beat you with a smaller lineup. If it's just Ballo, if it's just Malik Renew on the floor, you can put Luke Goody and Mackenzie Mbako in there at the 3 and 4, play a little bit smaller. You can even, we saw a couple of times earlier this year, a lineup with like Miles Rice, Trey Galloway, and Anthony Leal. You can have those types of 3 guard lineups, play with a little bit more pace. There's multiple different ways this Indiana team can beat you. And it was interesting because earlier this season, I asked Mike Woodson post game what this team's offensive identity was, and he said he doesn't know. And we might not know for a good portion of the season or even the entire season because Indiana's offensive identity, they don't really have one, but they don't need one. It's an ever changing offensive identity based on what the other team and what the opponent presents as a challenge that night. Now, Colin, I do have one question. Is it a potential bad thing for Indiana, this lack of an offensive identity, as we've discussed? Is it potentially a bad thing that it takes a feeling out period for Indiana to figure out what's working that night? I mean, you saw in that first half, it was a close game before Indiana and Mike Woodson realized, you know what, we got to go with Malik Renew and Umar Ball on the floor at the same time. Then that pull away and that closeouts kind of started happening for Indiana. The Hoosiers ended up blowing out Miami of Ohio. Is it a concern, I guess, that Indiana will enter a game not necessarily knowing what will work, having a strategy, but not knowing concretely what will work, and it will take some time in the game itself to figure it out that night?
It's an interesting question because if you don't know what the game plan is before the game, that's a concern. You should know what your plan is. Obviously, things don't always go according to plan, and that's true of any basketball game, but that's just true of anything in life, you know. You have to come prepared, but then when, the opponent throws things at you, you have to adjust. And it's about making those adjustments that is honestly the most important part of basketball because, it's a 40-minute game and you've seen a lot of times where the first half and the second half are completely opposite. And that's because one coach makes the right adjustments, the other coach doesn't. And the coach that makes the right adjustments usually wins the game. And that's been kind of a concern for IU basketball fans on Michael Woodson for a while now, is that he struggles to make those in-game adjustments. And I think with this two big versus one big lineup, he has a major opportunity to right those wrongs and make those right adjustments because if they play their cards right, I think they'll have a big size advantage against some Big Ten teams, but also have a big guard advantage on other Big Ten teams. I watched Michigan the other day against Arkansas, and they have great front court play, but their guard play isn't nearly as good as their front court play. And so against Michigan, you might not want to focus on getting the ball down low. You might want to use your guards more. And then, you have smaller teams like Minnesota, where the two big lineup really did work, where you had Renew have a major day, but also had Umar Ballo make significant contributions as well. So I think you kind of have to play it by ear. They need to have a game plan. If they don't, that's a concern. But you have to make those adjustments, and that's really the biggest key.
Think we do have to give some credit to Mike Woodson for making those in-game adjustments, not only against Miami of Ohio, but throughout the season, and also in Indiana's 82-67 win over Minnesota, which we'll jump into now. Indiana winning by 15 in their home Big Ten opener on Monday over the Golden Gophers of Minnesota. And yes, Umar Bala was good. Yes, Malik Renew was good. Indiana had 42 points in the paint. But it was really the story of two guys off the bench in this one, Colin, that kind of provided the spark for the Hoosiers when they needed it. Indiana and Minnesota were kind of trading buckets back and forth throughout the first 5, 6 minutes, really up until the second media timeout of the first half. And then Kanan Carlisle and Bryson Tucker came in and really changed the game. They were as impactful as anybody on the court for both teams. Bryson Tucker, 16 points in 20 minutes played against Minnesota. Kanan Carlisle, 14 points, both of which were off the bench. It was also Carlisle's first game back from dealing with that injury that kept him out for 3 consecutive games. But there's not much else we can say other than they were spectacular. Carlisle and Tucker were fantastic and exactly what Indiana needed off the bench.
Yeah, you said it exactly right. Those two were phenomenal, and they really led this Hoosier team to a victory. I'm not saying that without them, they wouldn't have won, but it certainly would not have been a blowout without them because, they came off the bench and they made the right plays, not only with the ball, but without the ball. They played with intensity. we heard Kanan Carlisle talk about post game how, he takes pride in his defense and he feels like, his focus is being on defense, putting a lot of effort in, helping his teammates wherever he can. And he said he doesn't care if he's a starter, if he's on the bench. He wants to help his team win, and he did exactly that against Minnesota. And then Bryson Tucker, he can really score the ball. I mean, we saw on several occasions this season, I think it was the Eastern Illinois game where he really, found his groove. And that was the second game of the season. And, again here against Minnesota, the first game of Big Ten play, he was really spectacular. And I wouldn't say that Tucker is, vying for a starting spot anytime soon just because of how key he is off the bench. And having a scorer like that off the bench is going to be super key, especially as we get deeper and deeper into Big Ten play, because, as great as the five starters may be for Indiana, they're going to get tired. And the Big Ten regular season is a grueling schedule. And so you're going to need those bench options. And we saw it against Minnesota that Tucker and Carlisle, and we saw it with Goody a couple games ago, is those three guys are going to be the main key bench options for Mike Woodson.
And Mike Whitson really only used those three guys off the bench against Minnesota. It was a three-man bench, an eight-man rotation for Indiana in their win over Minnesota. And you mentioned Bryson Tucker. The next thing for him is really that consistency. He didn't play great against Miami of Ohio. He hasn't played great in some stretches this year. He didn't have a good trip to the Bahamas and Atlantis. Granted, not many Hoosiers did have a great trip to the Bahamas, but it's just working on that consistency for him. That's something that'll come. He's just a freshman, just now 8 games into his collegiate career. But something that stood out to me and something that was really eye-opening from an opposition perspective is head coach Ben Johnson after the game, head coach for the Gophers. You were there, Colin, said after the game that Kanan Carlisle brought the juice for Indiana. That's the word that he used. He brought the juice for Indiana in this game. And that's really something that if you look back at Indiana's poor performances in the Bahamas, they lacked that juice. I don't want to get into the effort discussion, trying hard discussion. If you're stepping on the basketball cart, you're not trying to lose. So the effort discussion, we won't get there. But it's the juice that Indiana lacked. Indiana had no juice against Louisville. They had no juice against Gonzaga, but against Minnesota, they did have juice. And that juice in Ben Johnson's eyes came from Kane and Carlisle.
Oh yeah. And we're not talking about the juice from Jersey Mike's. We're talking about off the bench. Kanan Carlisle was, like I said, he was awesome. I mean, it was really refreshing to see because last year there weren't really that many bench options, especially at the guard position. It was very slim. And you saw guys like Gabe Cupps really get extended minutes as freshmen because there just weren't many options. But this year, the script has flipped. There are a lot of options coming off the bench, and it's just a deep team. And we've said, throughout the season, despite the bad performances, the depth and the talent of this team is not going to go away. I mean, you look at the eight-man rotation, that's great, but you could even get deeper because you have guys like Anthony Leal who didn't play against Minnesota, like Ja'Kai Newton who didn't play against Minnesota. Those guys, can also give you quality minutes in addition to the three solid bench guys we did see against Minnesota. So I think moving forward, bench play is not going to be an issue. Hustle is not going to be an issue. You saw the extended hustle from Luke Goody in a couple games ago where he said, I got on these guys. We're going to be fine now. We're ready to roll. And I believe it. I really think that, moving forward, this is going to be a much different Indiana basketball team than what we saw in the Bahamas.
And another thing about this game against Minnesota, it goes back to what we were saying after the game against Miami of Ohio. It was just sort of a different Indiana identity, the same yet different at the same time. Because yes, Indiana had 42 points in the paint. They shot 56.6% from the field. They were fantastic on the offensive end, especially attacking the basket. But a lot of those baskets on the inside were a byproduct of pace and tempo. And we knew pace and tempo, that was going to be a big thing going into the game against Minnesota. Minnesota ranked as the second slowest team in the entire country entering that game, according to Bart Torvik. They were averaging right around 19 seconds per possession so far this season, and IU did not let them slow them down on Monday. Indiana was able to get stops, and I think that's the first part. You're talking Mike Woodson, the Hoosiers, they've talked about playing with pace all season long. It's much, much easier to play with pace when you don't have to take the ball out from underneath the basket because you're giving up countless buckets after each defensive possession. If you can get a defensive stop, get a defensive rebound, and push it the other way, it's much, much easier to play with pace. And that's what we saw. And again, it goes back to crediting Kanan Carlisle. He brought that energy defensively. He's probably Indiana's best point of attack defender on the perimeter. And he really showcased that, getting stops for Indiana. And then one of the things, again, it was a moment in the game, it was telling for me. Less than 60 seconds into the second half, Miles Rice grabbed a defensive rebound underneath the basket for Indiana. And in 4 seconds, he had taken the ball by himself the length of the court and scored. It was a 4 second difference between his defensive rebound and Indiana scoring and Miles Rice scoring on the other end of the floor. And that really epitomized what the game plan was for Indiana. It was to outrun and outpace Minnesota. And that's exactly what Indiana did. And of course, that starts with Kanan Carlisle and it ends, or well, it ended against Minnesota with Renew and Ballo down low because they did a good job of running the floor and establishing that post position early on, and that allowed easy dump downs. It was a situation where Indiana shot a season high 29 free throws. A lot of that against Minnesota was because Ballo and Renew ran the floor in transition. They got deep post position, and then there's not many bigs or players or anything in the country that can stop Ballo or Renew from scoring without fouling them once they get that ball down low and deep post position. So I think that pace, Colin, was another huge aspect of this win for Indiana.
Exactly, exactly right. And pace has been a topic of conversation, throughout the off season and throughout the beginning of the season. Last year it was a big centered game for the Hoosiers. I mentioned the lack of guard play options, and that really slowed the game down, and that was not to the liking of many Indiana fans. And so this year, people were saying, okay, they need to shoot threes more, they need to, play fast more. And you saw against Minnesota, they played fast, and it led to better defense, and that better defense led to better offense. When you speed the game up against an opponent and you really control that tempo against a team who doesn't want to play fast, then you're going to have a really good shot to win. And they did. And I'd like to see that moving forward. You have to kind of control the game, and especially against teams you're supposed to beat, you definitely have to control the game because, you know, in order to make an upset, you got to control it early. And if you don't let that team trying to make an upset control the game early, you're probably going to win. And that's what they did against Minnesota. And that's what they're going to have to try to do against a lot of Big Ten teams because, Indiana was picked second in the league. And so there's a lot of teams that are looking, that were looking up at Indiana in the preseason thinking, okay, we kind of have to, get a big win. And that big win would have been against Indiana or Purdue. And those are kind of be the games circled on the schedule, except especially when it's at Assembly Hall, because like we always like to joke about, players have the best performances of their careers at Assembly Hall just because it's seen as a big game somehow. But at least for Minnesota, they really control it, and that's what led to the victory.
Now, before we move on to talking about Indiana's matchup on Friday against Nebraska, some news released yesterday. We're recording this on Thursday. Some news released yesterday on Wednesday that Indiana would be without guard Gabe Cupps, sophomore guard Gabe Cupps, for quote, indefinitely. Indiana Athletics released a statement. It read as follows, quote, Indiana sophomore guard Gabe Cupps underwent a successful surgery to treat a pre-existing nagging injury to his lower body. He will be out indefinitely, end quote, is what the statement from Indiana Athletics read. Later on Twitter, a couple of hours later, Gabe Cupps tweeted and showed himself appearing to lie in a hospital bed or something like that after surgery with his knee wrapped up. And he said along the lines of his meniscus was repaired. So he's basically alluding to the fact that it was a meniscus thing for Cupps. He'd played in just 4 games this year. He'd been dealing with an injury. He'd been labeled out on the availability report the last couple of weeks for Indiana, but good to see Cupps underwent successful surgery on what appears to be his meniscus. No timetable yet for his return. Now, Colin, moving on, Nebraska, a big time opportunity here for Indiana to potentially make a statement and kind of wash away all of those bad thoughts and woes from the Bahamas. You're going into Lincoln, a team that has looked good this year in Nebraska and a team that has looked not so good at points this year. Of course, they have that 74-63 win over Creighton. That was back on the 22nd of November. But they just lost by 37 just a few days ago on Saturday to Michigan State. That game was in East Lansing at the Breslin Center. They lost by 37, Colin. Road game or not, That's crazy to think about, especially considering they beat a then number 14 Creighton just a few weeks ago by double figures.
Yeah, Nebraska has had already a lot of highs and a lot of lows this season, like you mentioned. And I think this is a big game, obviously, just because it's the next game, as Kurt Signetti would like to say on the football side. But it's a big game because of how badly Nebraska beat Indiana last season, three separate times in three separate arenas. First at Pinnacle Bank Arena, next at Assembly Hall, and then next at the Target Center in Minneapolis in the Big Ten tournament, all were beatdowns at the hands of the Cornhuskers. And you saw Keisei Tominaga go off in all three of them. No Tominaga this time, but I think that Indiana has really got to win this one to kind of avenge those three awful losses from last season. And if they do win 2-0 in Big Ten play for the second straight season, that would be huge, especially as you kind of get into, the return of non-conference play, some easy bye games, and then you move into the bulk of the Big Ten schedule. And so winning this would be key because you would think that, IU would take care of business in the final non-conference games and then enter the new year with just two losses. And while that's not necessarily what the goal would have been at the start of the season. You would have liked to see 0 or 1 losses, but after those disastrous games in the Bahamas, escaping 2024 with only two losses is not the end of the world. I feel like it would be in many eyes of Indiana fans. So I think that winning this game is going to be incredibly key, not only because it's another game, but just because of the opponent and everything that's at stake.
I think you're exactly right. If you would have said back before the season starts that Indiana going into January could potentially be 12-2, of course, if they beat Nebraska, then handle business against Chattanooga and Winthrop, they'd be 12-2 going into January. And those two losses, yes, they didn't play well in those losses, but Louisville's a good team. Since that loss that Indiana took against them, Louisville's been decimated even more so by injuries. So that loss at the end of the year might not look as good as previously thought because Louisville is a good team fully healthy. They just aren't fully healthy and won't be fully healthy for the remainder of the season. But then that loss against Gonzaga again, Indiana didn't play well. Of course, that's kind of the bigger issue. But the loss itself isn't that bad. Gonzaga is going to be fighting for a top 3 or 4 seed in the NCAA tournament pretty much all season long. Gonzaga's a pretty good basketball team that is going to win a lot of games and probably going to win the WCC again this year. And they'll be battling for one of those top seeds come March. The thing with Nebraska, though, if we look at this from a defensive standpoint for Nebraska, they're really good at taking one guy away. They're really good at game planning and shutting down an opposing team's best player. If we go back to that Creighton game, yes, Pop Isaacs went for 25, but he got no help. Why? Because Nebraska shut down Ryan Kalkbrenner. Kalkbrenner had 4 points. He went 0 of 1 from the floor. He had one field goal attempt. This is a guy that had like 40 points on 27 field goal attempts earlier this year, Colin. Yes, in a bye game, but still, they were able to shut down Kalkbrenner, and that's a large part of why they beat Creighton. But then you look at the most recent loss against Michigan State. Yes, Trey Holloman and Jeremy Fears, two of the best players for Michigan State. They only combined for 14 points. They were limited to an extent by the Nebraska defense. Jaden Akins had 18 points. Jace Richardson had 16 points. Xavier Booker chimed in with 11 points. It's those other guys, maybe not the first or second options, that are really the key to beating this Nebraska team. And we've talked about it. Indiana's got talent. They can beat you not just with a multitude of ways, but a multitude of guys as well. So let's say Umar Ballo and Malik Renew, they're the focus of the defensive game plan for Nebraska. Maybe this is once again a Mackenzie Mbako game. Maybe Trey Galloway or Miles Rice will need to step up, but it will have to be other guys. Nebraska is going to make those other guys beat you. And Indiana set up with the depth they have to be able to win games like this.
Yeah, and Indiana had five guys in double figures against Minnesota. So if what you said becomes true against Nebraska and only one or two guys are limited, then well, that means the other three are still gonna be in double figures, still have huge games. And so I think that, that's what makes this Indiana team so dangerous. It's not because, of one particular player, it's because of how well-rounded the group is. And I think that, if Nebraska really focuses on the bigs, on Ballo and Renew, then, you'll see Miles Rice, you'll see Caden Carlisle, you'll see Bryson Tucker, you'll see Mackenzie Mbako, you'll see Luke Goody, really go off on the perimeter. And, Miles Rice, while he only only scored 2 points in the win against Minnesota, he was really key in kind of facilitating the ball, moving the ball around, playing fast. And so I think that, Miles Rice might be the X factor for this one against Nebraska. I'd also like to see Mackenzie Mbako return to the form he showed in IU's first game against Southern Illinois Edwardsville, where he kind of really opened some eyes, and he hasn't really returned to that so far in the rest of the season. But I think that, as we move forward, we're really going to start seeing that once again.
And another big thing with Nebraska is they will turn you over. They don't turn the ball over a lot themselves, but they will turn you over. On the season, they're about +5 and the turnover disparity, forcing about 16 turnovers a game. And that's really where a bulk of their offense comes from. They will turn you over and then get out and run. They're fast, they're long, they're athletic, pretty much 1 through 5 on the floor is Nebraska. So you can't turn it over, but that's not just on Indiana's guards. It's not just on Miles Rice and Trey Galloway. Indiana's big men and Malik Renew and Umar Ball have to be strong with the ball down low, because once they catch it, there's going to be 2, maybe even 3 bodies and pairs of hands coming down and swiping at the ball. So the bigs have to be strong with it as well for Indiana against Nebraska. Also, defensively for the Hoosiers, it's really got to be a focus about slowing down the backcourt of the Cornhuskers. Bryce Williams and Connor Seaton, the 2 players on the team, averaging north of 11 points per game. Williams at around 17 a game, and a Seaton, who might be a familiar name for Indiana fans, only around 13 points a game. They're also really the only 2 threats from 3-point territory. So it's one of those things where if Indiana can run those guys off the 3-point line and really kind of funnel them and force them into Umar Ballo at the rim, where he's been a great rim protector all season long, Indiana could have a pretty successful day defensively.
I agree. And, defense is where it starts. Like we mentioned on this episode, when you get those defensive stops, offense becomes just that much easier. And I think that, defense, especially on these Nebraska guards, is going to be key. And then once you get those stops, running with the ball, like I said, Miles Rice pushing the ball, getting that ball up the floor. And especially if you can have, Ballo and Renew get down there quick and early and get those quick, easy buckets that we've seen Indiana get in bunches at times, that's really going to be key because like we saw last year with these Nebraska matchups, if Nebraska is making their shots and Nebraska is able to get set defensively, that's really a lose-lose situation for Indiana. And so I like them to get those stops early, run with the ball, get those easy baskets, and I'd like Indiana in this matchup a lot.
It's not the same Nebraska team it was a year ago when they beat Indiana 3 separate times in 3 different venues. No Keisei Tominaga, as you mentioned earlier. The 3-point shot isn't as dangerous for them. They're not as much of a threat to really light it up from deep as they were a season ago, but still a team that's going to try and force you to turn the ball over a ton. So it should be a good matchup on Friday night in Pinnacle Bank Arena in Lincoln, Nebraska. Indiana versus Nebraska. The Hoosiers then get over a week off before coming back home to play Chattanooga on Saturday, the day after, of course, the big college football playoff game between Indiana and Notre Dame. Well, that will wrap up this week's episode of the Hoosier Podcast, presented by thehoosier.com and powered by the Rivals Network. Head over to thehoosier.com and at Indiana Rivals on X/Twitter so you don't miss out on any of the latest Indiana athletics news. Once again, for Colin McMahon, I've been Zach Browning saying thank you so much for tuning in. We'll see you next week for a special college football playoff preview episode of the Hoosier Podcast.